Hello, everyone. I am Marcia Civic, and this is Be Provided Conservation Radio. My guest today is Edward Struzik. He has recently published a new book called Swamplands, Tundra Beavers, Quaking Bogs, and the Improbable World of Peat. And he has published this through Island Press, and you can find his book at islandpress.org. And this book is a tribute to bogs, fens, peatlands, swamplands. It brings awareness to beauty and diversity of the amazing living things that reside in these places that most people think uninviting, buggy, and kind of spooky in some cases. But after reading Ed's book, you'll realize that peatlands and swamplands are very essential ecosystems. And if we can get our act together and stop destroying them and draining them and start conserving and restoring, they can play a crucial role in our climate change story. So welcome to the show today, Ed. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I believe you're in Alberta, Canada, right? You're in Edmonton?
Right. Very cold Edmonton, the Rock down to about minus 30 degrees Celsius with a couple of feet of snow on the ground.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you're up there. There's not much north of you, is there, as far as cities or
We're,
um
we're the most northerly metropolitan center all of Canada. Over a million people, but that's basically it as far north as it gets.
yeah. Yeah, so you're really probably close to some of these areas that you talk about in your book, I would think. So, yeah. So I'm excited. Congratulations on your book. I found it really fascinating. I grew up near some swamplands in Michigan, and we used to go out on these floating peat bogs up in the Upper Peninsula near Houghton, Michigan. You kind of walk on them, and you can feel it floating like a kind of a magic carpet thing. And there was all sorts of flowers and birds and those carnivorous, what are they called? The carnivorous plants,
Sundews and picture.
yeah, pitcher plants. Yeah, those were amazing to see. I thought that really opened my eyes to swamps. And when we were younger, we always used to stay up at night in a fort that we had near a swamp and see like thousands of fireflies, buzzing all over the place. A bunch of lights popping up. It was amazing. So,
Yeah, really, they really are magical places.
yeah, so thank you for writing about them. How did you get interested in writing about these places that most people find kind of obscure?
Well, it began for me in the early 90s. I was canoeing the most northerly navigable river in the world, the Thompson. Up in, if you would imagine the Yukon and Alaska, there's the Arctic archipelago north of that. And there's one island called Banks Island, and the Thompson flows through the north end of it. And I think we were the only second party to actually do it. But what was remarkable about that island and the trip was that how much life we saw. There was 88,000 muskox, which
Wow.
I can't really, we're about 2,000, two-thirds of all the muskox in the world. A genetically distinct population of wolves, Peary caribou, which are no bigger than, say, Great Danes, maybe a little bigger.
Oh,
But
interesting.
and there were hundreds of thousands of geese, sandhill cranes, and it was very lush. It kind of reminded me of the north end of Scotland. I was trying to figure out why is this place so biologically important and unique compared to the 700 and I think there's 27,000 islands in the archipelago. Why is this place so special? And I realized the common denominator is that it's thick with peat. And as every gardener knows, peat is one of the great mediums for growing things. So that's what people buy peat moss. And so things can rise up fairly comfortably, prosperously in the soils there where they can't in the rest of the polar desert. And so I glommed onto this idea is that there's something in peatlands that make them very unique. They represent only about 3-4% of the world's terrestrial surface, but biologically they are very very unique. And
It,
so I just started exploring them more and more and trying to pinpoint different spots around the world where they're found.
That's amazing. So this took you all over the world to discover some of these different peatlands, right?
Pretty
So,
much.
yeah,
Northern Alaska, Minnesota has got I think 1.5 million acres of peat. A lot of the areas Michigan used to have a lot of peat.
right.
Uh, there's the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, North Carolina, but different parts of Maine. Those are all remnants of peatlands that were all drained during the settlement of North America.
Yeah, yeah, and I do wanna discuss a little bit more, about the challenges that these peatlands are having. You talked about draining, but I also, before we get into that, just a quick definition. You mentioned, you refer to peatlands, fens, bogs, marshes. Are they all the same thing, or how do I mean, they have many different names. Are
They
they?
do.
Yeah.
You know, peatlands are bogs and fens, and to a lesser extent, swamps and marshes that accumulate in cold, waterlogged, oxygen-starved conditions. And peat is partially decayed vegetation that builds up over centuries. And basically the foundation for most of the peat in the world are mosses, which really is a super plant. It can hold 25% of its weight in moisture and survive
Oh,
intense drought and extremely cold temperatures. They're absolutely beautiful. They're kind of like miniature forests if you get down on your hands and knees and explore. And so that really represents what peat is all about. And it's complicated because the deeper you go into it, this is what boggled my mind is that there's a big difference between a fen and a bog. For
okay.
example, a lot of people in your part of the world in California might call some area a swamp or a bog, but really there are no bogs in California.
I was gonna ask
In
that.
fact, all of Western United States, there's only been one bog that's ever been found in the Western United States.
Really?
Every Yeah, and that
Wow.
was just fair. So it demonstrates just how little we know about them and how poorly understood they have been, and how really different they are. A fen produces a much different environment of plants and animals than say a bog, which is tends to be less acidic. But then it's contradictory in some ways as well, is because some fens in the Sierra Nevadas, Yellowstone National Park, are some of the most acidic environments in the world.
Okay. Does much life live in some of those fens in those acidic environments? Is there,
There
you know,
is.
diversity?
Not a lot, but this is the beauty of some of these plants. Animals that live there and insects and moths and butterflies is that you think about a sundew or a pitcher, there's very little nutrition that they can get from the ground or, because it's so acidic, lacks nitrogen, which can't grow, which does not thrive in acidic conditions. And so they've evolved in a unique way is that they catch flies and mosquitoes, and that's the way they get most of their. And just to add a little, another tantalizing bit is that, we used to think it was just flies and mosquitoes, but a couple of years ago, biologists in Algonquin National Park in Canada found that they were actually eating salamanders as well.
Oh, really?
Trapping salamander, juvenile salamanders, not fully grown ones, but
Yeah.
that was only in 2017. So you can imagine there's these really unique and they're weird looking plants. The pitcher plant is quite strange looking.
Yeah.
It's out of the day of the triffids. And the fact that it can actually capture something of that size and that mobile and be able to consume it. And that's the way they live. And so you really
I
have
did not.
this very strange, weird assortment of critters that live in these environments. But at the same time, you have many, common plants or animals, especially like caribou and grizzly bears that inhabit these places for a variety of reasons. And one of them being, for example, is that if you want to pick blueberries or cranberries, you have to go into a peatland because they're acid loving plants. And so that's where grizzly bears go to get food when, meat's not available on the landscape.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, there was a old, like, area in Michigan, near Traverse City, Michigan, that was cranberries. It was kind of looked like more of a dried up peatland, but yeah, I guess they used to get cranberries out of there back in the day. I didn't.
That whole Great Lake state area used to be part of a massive system of wetlands, bogs, and fens back in the day. And if farther east you went, it was called the Black Swamp. And 70% of those states were covered in these bogs and fens. And they were all drained thanks in large part to three swamp acts that were passed by Congress in
Wow.
1850, 1849, 50, and 1860, which essentially gave the states all of those wetlands, these peatlands, on the condition that they drain them.
What was the purpose of them draining these swamps? What?
Well, there was a variety of purposes. The biggest one was that they wanted to turn these lands into agriculture, into farms. And the other reason was public health. They believed that swamps and bogs were the source of miasma, unhealthy soils that were the cause of diseases such as cholera. And of course, they were wrong. The term swamp fever was a very common term in the 19th and early 20th century. You go to the doctor, you've got, the flu or a terrible cold, and they would say, well, you're a farmer, you live near a swamp. And so many people actually purposely drained those areas to get rid of what they thought were unhealthy soils.
Interesting.
And if you think about it, in the upper Great Lakes region, one of the biggest industries in the, say, late 19th, early 20th century were tile factories that produced tiles to drain peatlands.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, there are hundreds of them.
Wow. I did not
But
know that.
yeah,
Okay.
I didn't. It was it as well. I was trying to figure out how could they drain so much water from those lands in such a short period of time, and
Mm.
it was actually using what was called the French drain, which was named after William French, who was I think, the treasurer, assistant treasurer for Congress in the 1850s and 60s. And he was one of those people who believed that they were all very unhealthy soils. It's quite a personal story for him because his wife died of swamp fever, and he believed that it came from their very damp basement. And so he brought over these draining tiles from Britain, where he'd heard about them, and introduced them to the United States.
Oh, wow. I wonder what she actually died of. It'd be interesting, but it's
Any
is
number of days, but he believed it was from the damp soils. They lived near a swamp.
wow.
Um, and so he went on a mission. It was his mission in life as he was quoting another Scotsman who said, we need to drain the whole earth of moisture.
A whole different meaning to drain the swamps here. Yeah.
It, that's actually where the phrase comes from. It's
Wow.
the swamp back in the 18th century, where it became the mantra of most Americans was to get rid of these unhealthy soils and also to turn them into farmland.
That's crazy because back then, I mean, there was more land available than there is now. It's like, yeah, they could have gone elsewhere, but yeah, and do these swamps emit any type of gas? You hear about how swamps glowing at night and the various, of course, the fireflies are glowing, but also is there usually like sometimes a glow coming from the swamps?
Yeah, you get
Yeah,
hydrogen sulfide or sulfur dioxide.
yeah.
There could be kind of a form of spontaneous combustions where they will light up. And in fact, the first scientific experiment was done in New Jersey bog by George Washington. And he was trying to dispel the myth that the lights that the soldiers were seeing in these bogs and fens were, as they say, the haunts of will-o-wisp, jack-o'-lanterns, moss people who would come to get them. And he knew otherwise. So what he did was he took them out on a boat and he stirred up the bottom of the bog so that the gas would come up, and had one of the soldiers holding a torch.
Hmm.
And of course, it puffed out.
Oh,
And he proved in that experiment that it had nothing to do with ghosts. It had to do with the chemical reaction that was coming from the bottom of the bog.
smart guy. Yeah. That's interesting. So when did some of these or myths kind of change? I assume not all folk culture thought that bogs were bad, but when did, like here in the US, when did we realize that draining swamps, or maybe we haven't yet, is bad? It's not a good thing.
It's been fairly recently, and many people still hold on to those myths. My mother, for example, who's Polish,
Hmm.
uh, would tell me when I was a child not to skate too late into the night on the bog because there was a creature called Mora or Kikamora who would follow me home, and this had this critter kind of had a chicken-like feet and a beak of a really sinister critter, and it would follow you home and get into the keyhole and not leave and terrorize you, and in some cases eat you if she wanted. So,
Wow.
even I grew some of these myths. It really wasn't until around the 1970s, 80s when biologist named William Nearing out of Connecticut, I think, really saw bogs and fens and swamplands as the kidneys of the landscape. And it was really an understanding that there were great filters of contaminants. If you think about the antiseptic qualities, the acidic nature of it. They produce a chemical which takes out some of the contaminants, neutralizes many of the nutrients that are now going into the Great Lakes. One of the reasons why the Great Lakes is filling up with so much algae was that peatlands like the Black Swamp in the upper Great Lakes were drained. And so they were
Okay.
no longer filtering water that went into the Great Lakes. And so all those nutrients that you get from the farms, which would normally be neutralized by the chemicals within the peat, are no longer there. So the nutrients are going straight into the Great Lakes, and that's the reason why we have this problem, eutrophication of the Great Lakes.
Hmm. Yeah, I've noticed, like, going back home to Michigan where I grew up, yeah, Lake Michigan, there's a lot more algae and growth now than when we were growing up, you
Now,
know?
part of climate change,
Yeah,
the water warmer.
right.
The fact is that the other thing that Peat does, and the Vikings understood. Well, here's a good classic example of it. The Vikings used bogged water on long voyages because it would stay fresher than water that they got from a river or lake. And the U.S. Navy was doing this on the East Coast. They would be docking at places like the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and taking bog water there because it would also stay fresher on the long voyages. And so that's the neat thing about this is that they really are the filters, the kidneys of the landscape.
That's amazing. Yeah, and you mentioned they only make up, what, 3 to 4% of our terrestrial landscape, correct? But yet they're able to store more carbon as well than some of the forests in the Amazon, and that's a big thing for our climate change story, correct?
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah,
If you think about it, the Hudson Bay lowlands, which are the second largest peatland in the world and the most intact in northern Canada, stores 5 times more carbon per acre than the Amazon rainforest, which is considerable. And
mhm,
that in whole, that 3-4% of the landscape, which has got peat, stores twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined.
wow.
So they are an incredible storehouse of carbon. And I think, we don't know it here in the United States, appreciate just how much carbon they store. But if you look at Europe, Scandinavia, and even Russia, they're beginning to understand that places like Great Britain are now restoring many of the bogs and fens that they destroyed in order to meet their climate change goals.
That's good to hear. Yeah. Yeah. And so when people, like you mentioned, peat is used for a lot of gardening and, so peat is harvested and taken out. So doing so, kind of destroying those is releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, correct? I mean, that's doing some harm.
It is, but I think there's a bigger issue because one thing you've got to give credit to the peat industry is that sometime around the turn of the century they understood that they were looking at what was happening in Europe, where they basically destroyed most of their peatlands, and that the legislature started coming in that can't do this anymore. And they saw this coming in North America. And so to reduce their footprint, they're growing peat,
Oh,
going back areas that they've harvested and regrowing peat in those areas. And it's a pretty small fraction of what they've taken out. I'm not saying it doesn't have an impact. We should probably be looking at alternatives. But the bigger, villain in this are the mines and the roads and, cities.
mhm.
Most cities have drained their peatlands for a number of reasons, to build subdivisions, expand their, put in more people for mosquito control. Washington D.C. has tried do this for the longest time. They always had this mosquito issue,
Mhm.
and so they've drained so much of their peatland that it is now coming back to haunt them. We're seeing places all around North America where massive floods because if you think about sphagnum moss, which is one of the foundations of peat, can absorb 26% of its weight in moisture.
Mhm.
And so if you look at a bog or a fen as this big sponge, so, that can soak up all the water that will come from a flood. And we're seeing now some of the worst flooding in North America occurring in places where there used to be bogs and fens because there's nothing there
Nothing to stop.
to absorb the moisture anymore. California is one of those places which are now realizing that maybe the best thing we should do is restore some of these bogs and fens, not only to, stop flooding that takes place, during the heavy rain season,
Mhm.
but also to slow wildfires.
Yeah,
You'd ask, firefighter, a bog or a fen or a swamp is their best friend because
it's gonna
you
slow
can
it.
turn.
Yeah, yeah, and you also just to plug your other book, you have another book, I haven't read it yet, Firestorm, correct? And
Yep,
I believe you do talk a little bit about that in that book. Am I right in saying that? Correct in saying
yep,
that?
you are.
Okay, okay.
Uh, in fact, the funny story about this, I think if I'm maybe mistaken. It was I think it was Wisconsin that experimented with the idea of, and Oregon did this as well in the 1930s and 40s, is that they would move beavers that were cutting down trees, in areas and, building dams in areas where there were people. And instead of, trapping them out and killing them, they were experimenting with the idea of putting them into the backcountry where they would build dams and the water that they created, it held back could be used to fight fires.
Mm.
The funny story there is that they realized at that time that trying to bring in beavers on the backs of donkeys wasn't really good because they didn't get along.
I
And
bet.
so they ended up parachuting them in wooden crates
Oh my gosh.
into the high country in the backwoods where there are no roads. And the idea being that either they would chew their way out of the crates once they landed, or the crate would break.
Mhm.
And this was actually fairly successful in its early stages. And so states like California now are reintroducing beavers in areas that they've been tapped out for a century.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, I read a little bit about that. Wasn't some of the project didn't it go a little bit crazy when they were reintroduced to some areas without any predators, so the beavers
Yeah,
kinda overpopulated a little bit, but
that was in Patagonia.
oh, that was Patagonia, okay, okay.
It flew in, I think it was 36 or 43 beavers from Canada. The idea of the sole purpose was to create a fur industry in Patagonia. What they didn't realize was that there were no predators of beavers in California. And so they've run amok, and it's just an ecological disaster.
Oh,
Hundreds of thousands of acres of forest. And there's no real clear way of essentially reducing their numbers.
wow. Yeah, I know they're talking about getting the jaguars reintroduced to Patagonia, maybe that'll help, but yeah.
Maybe I don't
So
one of the things in from the part of the world Europe. the Voyageur National Park that just discovered that wolves there are unique in that they prey on beavers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's one of the several new things that we learned about peatlands, that I learned about peatlands in researching this book.
That interesting. Well, that was one of my questions because you have traveled all over. You went, I mean, you even talk about in your book the Mojave Desert, which I wouldn't even think of as a peatland or having a peatland at some point in time. But yeah, what was the most intriguing thing that you learned or that really surprised you?
Well, there's a lot, visiting the Mojave Desert. There is a remnant peatland that was much larger than it is today for a variety of reasons. One of them being climate change, is that that part of the world eventually turned into a desert. It used to be glaciated or was flooded by glaciation, and climate change really dried things up. But what accelerated it was the attempt by a lot of people, mostly Californians, who came in and saw an opportunity to use that water that was there, plus the peat, which was a soil conditioner, to try to create, farms,
Mhm.
farmland, livestock, which was, you think about it, crazy ideas to put cows in temperatures that are 120 degrees at certain times of the year. And there was even a plan at one point that got approval, nearly went ahead, to build a city with a artificial lake where you could water ski. And the end was put on that largely because around the time of the 70s, when Nearing came along and said these places are really important. And it's a wonderful story because a lot of celebrities stepped into it. I think Jack Lemmon actually narrated a documentary about the Mojave Desert fens and bogs. And the New York Times got really interested in the story. And the case went actually to the Supreme Court, which decided against allowing that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, that'd be something to see, hear, see some of these videos maybe. Are they available? Can you see them talking about some of these places?
There's a few. I haven't been able to track down the one by Jack Lemmon.
Yeah.
I failed it. It must be somebody, the Library of Congress somewhere, but I haven't been able to track it down. One of the things that I did track down, which was just kind of funny, was that the 49ers, the gold rush seekers that came through, from the east to the west. Some of them came through the Mojave Desert. And in 1959, the state of California, was actually 49, the state of California decided to hold a centennial celebration of this great event of going through Death Valley, and, where the gold seekers stopped to get water, from these bogs and fens, and there was, they actually tried to steal food from the native people, indigenous people who lived there, and they were growing, crops,
Mhm.
corn, squash, and whatnot. But they had this centennial celebration, and they asked everybody to come, and they expected, maybe 1,000 people might drive in, and it turned out to be a Woodstock. There were at least 65,000 people.
Wow.
Some say 100,000 people. Jimmy Stewart, the actor who had just come off, his great role in A Wonderful Life, came in, and they did a pageant with a number of A stars to reenact that whole thing. I
Oh,
thought that
interesting.
was,
That is really cool. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. So
and the composer, there's Frederick Grofe, an American composer, classical composer, uh, wrote his Death Valley Suite for that event, and it was performed with him as conductor there in the desert.
oh, that's great. I'll have to check that out. So back to some unique things that you've seen in the peatlands. Like, I know you talk about extreme botany in Hawaii in your book, and that sounds like an extreme sport kind of thing. But these people are doing amazing things, saving these plants that are rare and going extinct. And I mean, you talk about so many, you talk about the red wolves and and their reintroduction process. And yeah, I was just curious, is there any other thing that stuck out to you that was really a surprise?
There's, yeah, many of them.
Yeah.
The fact that you've got rattlesnakes in Canada that are really no one could quite figure out how they could survive a Canadian winter. And it was just discovered by a graduate student in 2018, and I was with her in the Georgian Bay area, is that the way they survive and the way turtles as well survive in that really cold Canadian winter is that they den in peat.
Wow.
And peat
Yeah.
has great insulation qualities. And I know this for a fact because I have this 100-year-old house that I live in, first moved in, discovered that the walls were insulated with peat moss. But the problem is, as everybody who has dealt with peat knows, is that once you take it out of the ground, it begins to dry out. And so it loses, about 5, 6 times its mass. So it all settled down to the bottom. And that's why that was why our walls were covered in ice in the wintertime.
Yeah. It was losing its insulation properties a little bit. Yeah.
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 So that's where rattlesnakes and turtles go in winter is that they den in peat. I thought that was pretty cool.
That is
The
really
other
cool.
story that I found really fascinating was there was this moth, the Ami borer. In the world of entomology, it was a big thing because only 8 specimens had ever been found in the last 100 years. And then there was this group of your entomologists are relentless. They don't give up on the idea of finding something that may be extinct, and they go to the ends of the earth to try to find them. And so there's this century-long effort to find the Ami borer,
Wow.
and most of them believe that they lived in the sandy areas of Wisconsin and Michigan until one was actually accidentally found in a bin. And the scientist from Wisconsin, Kyle Johnson, who I spent some time with, ended up spending something 111 days at nighttime traveling 3,000 miles exploring these fins before he actually found one. And now he's found, I think, several dozen. And he's a bit of a celebrity in the world of entomology now. Well, I mean, he was sleeping in ditches. These fins are not anywhere near hotels.
Well, yeah, yeah, he wanted to get out there because you probably have to be out there in the morning or evening, I would think
Yeah.
to
Trout fishing. So he
yeah.
would just sleep in the ditch and then resume the daytime and resume his hunt at night. It's quite a character.
I remember reading about that. I was gonna show I didn't hold up your book cover before in case this is a video. So is this the moth on your book cover that we're talking about?
No, it's not.
One of
It's
these?
it's a yeah, no,
Oh,
it's a pretty ordinary looking brown.
oh, okay.
Uh,
I wanted to ask that, yeah.
yeah, no, it would be nice. Like there's a Luna moth, which is absolutely gorgeous. Probably one of the prettiest moths in the world in my mind. And
Mhm.
they inhabit fens in the upper Great Lakes area, and it's absolutely mesmerizing. It's a green, translucent, something that you would think Walt Disney would have kind of created
Yeah.
for a film.
They have kind of
Uh,
pink, antennae, don't they? Or like a
and
yeah.
they've got these little eyelets on their wings that kind of gotta come hither, look about. But they're actually quite vicious. If predators come along, they kind of vomit on them. It's sort of this awful chemical spray that wards them off.
That's one thing I did learn when reading your book on that chapter about that. Because I've only seen one Luna moth in my life, and that was on North Manitou Island when we were backpacking. And it was a sight to see. I was pretty young. I didn't really realize what an amazing thing I was seeing, but I didn't realize how vicious they were until I read that part in your book. So
Yeah, they have,
yeah,
and they did the interesting thing about them is that they don't have a mouth, so they don't feed when they're
yeah,
an adult. Name in this part of the world is the Sasquatch of the boreal forest because so few have been seen that some people don't believe that they exist. But
wow,
yeah, you'd imagine seeing one of these beautiful, delicate creatures that somehow can survive, -40 degree.
yeah. Yeah, the one I saw was a pretty good size. How big do they usually get? Do you know?
Almost if you sort of hold out your hand,
Yeah.
they can get to that size. You get the tiger moths as well. I spent another evening with another entomologist, and what they do is they it's called sugaring. They they paste this attractant on a trunk of a tree, and they put up a white blanket, and then they have the light glow. And it was just absolutely amazing how what you would think a dormant forested fen would suddenly come alive, and these giant moths would come, would light down. I just
That's amazing.
I was absolutely gobsmacked by, the movement, how much activity it is there at nighttime when you think that everything goes to sleep. But,
Mhm.
we had hooting of owls there. I think we caught, I figured there were 6 different owls that we heard that night, and in
Love it.
addition to all different moths. It was wonderful.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, like when I was a kid spending the night near the swamp with the fireflies, we heard owls, we heard coyotes in the distance, we heard frogs, just all sorts of things happening out there. A whole different world comes to life in the dark. So it's a
Yeah,
lot
yeah.
it's a lot of
They're,
fun.
re- they're magical place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I really hope people get a chance to read this book and really fall in love with these areas. So what do you want people to take away with your book? What was the purpose of getting this out?
Well, the purpose was, to first of all, to I think introduce the world to a landscape that we kind of overlooked. We've degraded. You can get fined in some cities $100,000 for cutting one tree,
Right.
but you can drain a swamp and there be no repercussions whatsoever. The mining companies do this all the time. Forestry companies do it, and but there's so many other virtues of it. They not only they filter water, they store carbon, but they have this wonderful. They're also old growth forests. Some of the
Mhm.
oldest in the world are found in bogs and fens throughout the United States, especially in deep south. And they've evolved in a very unique way that I think we fail to appreciate. We're a society that has been conditioned to appreciate mountaintops, sunburnt, deserts, and the Vermont forests, the maple forest, and in the fall time. But we for a variety of reasons, mainly cultural and also because of access, we've really overlooked the beauty and importance of these landscapes. So they're not just you know great storers of carbon, which is really important at this juncture of our history in dealing with climate change. But they're worth preserving. And the beauty of it is, if you I compare it to Arctic sea ice, is that Arctic sea ice is disappearing really quickly because we're warming the climate up so rapidly. And it's not going to come back anytime soon. There's nothing we really can do. They're talking about, you know, spring silica in the air to reflect the rays of the sun, which I think has potentially dangerous consequences. But
Yeah.
we can restore peatland, and it doesn't take an awful lot. It takes a lot to grow a tree, for example,
Mm.
because trees need nutrients, they need water, as do swamps, bogs, and fens. But bogs and fens don't like nutrients. Mosses just don't do well in those kinds of conditions. So all you really need is water, and to restore the water flow that what we did in the past was we diverted the waters away from these areas. All we have to do is divert them back,
Mhm.
which doesn't take an awful lot. China did this in the Zogi Plateau, which is the biggest wetland in the world, and they drained it during the Cultural Revolution, thinking that they were going to create agricultural land. And what they realized was that they were destroying a water supply that was important to tens of millions of people downstream. So they've been spending billions of dollars restoring it, and they've done it successfully.
Great.
And we're doing it in certain parts of, Canada and the United States, the Great Dismal Swamp, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services now, you know, bringing back water, re-wetting some of that landscape. But we've got to do a lot more of it. Uh,
Mm.
it's great to, say many governments say, let's plant 10 million trees, and that's going to help, deal with climate change. And I don't argue that, but I believe you pack a much bigger punch by simply restoring and protecting the peatlands that we have.
That's great. So, when restoring these peatlands, how long would it take to kinda have them be efficient and vibrant again? So
Well, I was surprised to see, the peat moss industry, which has really been behind a lot of this solely to save themselves, that you start seeing the results within 10, 15 years. And
wow.
within 30 years, they've restored, 86% of what was there before they mined it all out, which isn't perfect. But in, say, 10 or 20 years of research and development, they've really, been successful.
Mhm.
My point that we're probably best off just trying to protect what we have, but I think we really can restore a lot of the degraded peatlands around the United States and Canada fairly cheaply and efficiently.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it would be a highly expensive process, but
So
what can individuals do as far as, gardening or anything like that? Is there anything
increasingly, I think we're starting to see some alternatives to soil conditioners other than peat moss, and I think that will come. It's challenging because peat moss is so good conditioning soils.
yeah,
Um,
holds the
it-
moisture in and yeah,
y- so that's one way of looking. But I think that also, it sounds a little bit corny, but if you just start alerting decision makers to the importance of these areas and fighting attempts to, drain a wetland so that we put up a new subdivision. I've just seen it so often throughout North America where people are just, shrug their shoulders when, a city says, okay, we're going to drain 40 acres of this swamp to so that we can build some houses. And I think that if we start looking at a different way, our decision makers will notice.
that's good. That's good. Well, I found your book very, very interesting. I like your writing style. I hope people will take a look at this book. Where can people find this book and learn more about you? You have like what, 4 or 5 other books out there as well, and I know Firestorm's on my reading list for the next one, but
The book has been selling remarkably well.
good.
My first advice is just order it from your local bookstore. They would be my suggestion. They may have it. You could order through Island Press, my publisher, directly. If all fails, then Amazon I know stocks it as well. So it's out there.
Good, good. That's good to hear. So, yeah, and congratulations. And do you have a website where people can learn more about you or
I
and
do.
what you're up
If you
to?
look at,
Okay.
I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook,
Okay.
Twitter. There's a profile of me on Island Press. So you want to know more about me or just email me?
Sounds good. I can post some of this information in the show notes too, as well, some links. But before I let you go, it's funny, I was reading part of the book. So it's been a while since I actually read the book. So I was perusing last night and I came across where you were out. Now I forgot where it was, but there was a yellow flower that you found on the side of the road that was thriving, this rare yellow flower. I think you said, I'm going to try not to go back and see if this is surviving anymore because, trucks are going by and spraying it, but yet this flower is still living in this harsh environment. I was just curious if you ever went back there to see if it was still
Yep.
there.
I've been there twice
Have you?
since the book published, and they're lady slip.
Lady slippers, that's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, they're absolutely, the myth is that they're the slipper of fairies
Yeah.
that inhabit places, and they're just it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous orchid. And it was growing out of a fen that I visit fairly regularly. In fact, it's a tiny, tiny fen that has got some prominence. It was actually mentioned in it's something like 1,500 species of wasps there.
Wow.
friendly wasps, predatory wasps there that basically are new to nature that have no names.
Wow.
Um, and it, they also have these orchids. I think they have 36 different orchids that are found there. So most of the orchids in Western North America can be found in this tiny, tiny place. But my favorite
Wow.
certainly is the lady slipper.
They're
And
beautiful.
I could back one day I was out with an entomologist friend of mine and we saw these lady slipper orchids growing right along the side of the road and getting splashed by cars going by. And I was just thinking, is this their, they're awfully hardy, but is this their their will to live and expand to find new places, kind of like Captain Kirk, new places to explore and live. And I've gone back and they're still there
Oh,
and they're the number I'm finding more and more new ones. So it just shows you how resilient these ecosystems are.
that's amazing. Yeah, because you think of lady slippers and orchids as such delicate plants, but they're pretty resilient, it sounds like. So,
They really are because
yeah.
when you think of extremely harsh environments, they they're dormant under minus 30, 40 degree weather, and what keeps them alive are those warm springs, groundwater that comes through, and how they endure is really it just shows you how life hangs on.
Mhm. Yep. That's amazing. And so also before I let you go, I wanted to make sure, did we cover everything that you would like to promote your book with or talk about peatlands and swamplands? I know we were kind of on different topics. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we covered everything. This for me, they're the most underrated ecosystem out there, and
Mhm.
they provide so many ecological services that they're really worth preserving, and also visiting. More and
Mhm.
more of these are being made more accessible by the boardwalks that are being built through them. What's really encouraging to see a lot of people joining associations. The Nature Conservancy, I have to say, has for decades now been buying up peatlands and preserving them, restoring them.
That's great.
And maybe on a final note is that we for the longest time most people didn't think that there were fens high up in the mountains. But there's a scientist out of Colorado, David Cooper, who has discovered more than 3,000. He and his colleagues have found more than 3,000 in the Sierra Nevadas, Yellowstone, in just the last 10, 20 years.
Wow.
So they're kind of remapping, California, Montana, the highlands there. And these fens contain critters, plants, and animals that are found nowhere else in the state.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. Yeah, I'd like to learn more about that for sure. So, well, thank you for joining us today, Ed. I appreciate it. And
It was
yeah, it was a fun conversation. It brought me back to my childhood a little bit, back in
yeah.
Michigan. So, so it's a great book. So I hope everyone who's listening goes out and gets a copy. So, but thank you again, Ed. And yeah, well, if you maybe we'll have you on the show again. So
Great.
I would love to have you. Yeah, thank you. And we'll talk to you soon. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.